Welcome to the Classroom Café, where it's all about brewing the conversation between fellow educators. This special presentation is brought to you by the United Federation of Teachers and the union's Member Assistance Program. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this podcast inspires you, nourishes you, and motivates you. Now let's get started. Hi, I'm Selma Williams, and welcome to another episode of the Classroom Café. As we all know, February is widely considered the month of love. But for many people, love can be complicated by many other factors that can even impact their safety. In this episode of the Classroom Café, we would like to highlight the topic of domestic violence, and more specifically, how it might appear in the school setting. Jules Perkél is a licensed clinical social worker who has specialized in trauma and anti-violence work for over a decade. She is also an anti-racism facilitator and trainer. In her presentation, we will hear Jules discuss a brief discussion of domestic violence, the working definition of domestic violence, how to assess abusive relationships, and strategies to support domestic violence survivors. Now, we know domestic violence is a sensitive topic and can be triggering for some, so just note that as we go through the presentation. Let's get right into it.
Why would it be important in the relationship that a teacher has with a student, or that a teacher or a social worker has with a parent, to understand domestic violence in the context of a larger society? We want to frame it in the context of a larger society because we know that systemic level norms and culture manifest in institutions like schools. And these structural influences and the impacts that those structural influences have on community, and then the influences that those communities have on the family, makes it so that there are certain behaviors that have become permissible. And some of those behaviors that have caused harm have also become permissible. So if we want to help our young people, and if we want to help parents who are survivors of domestic violence, we need to be able to see them not just as individuals who have survived, but we want to be able to see them in the context of a society which has paved a way or paved a path for that kind of harm to take place. And one of the ways that we do that is through understanding and reckoning with a little bit of our history and how that societal dynamic has come to be. These are just a few examples that I'm going to run through, because we could actually take a whole 16-week course to go through the history of intimate partner violence alone. But one way that we do that is that we shape it through the perspectives of female bodies becoming property. In early Roman society, a woman was deemed the property of the husband and therefore was subject to his control. And if we think about where much of our contemporary society finds its derivatives, oftentimes people, at least in Western Eurocentric kind of framing, tend to go back to Greco-Roman society. So we leave it showing up in the context of the ancients. In terms of religious endorsement of this hierarchy, in medieval Europe, the dominant view of women was that they were intellectually and morally weaker than men. And this was tainted by Eve's original sin according to a biblical tradition. And this biblical tradition was used as a justification for many restrictions in that period of time that were placed on women. Such as not being allowed to own property, or and also circling around to the young people, to the children in the hospital, in the society, not the hospital, the obligation to obey their fathers and their husbands at all times. This then trickles down into the common law in England, and where we find a lot of our American laws derived from. But the common law in England gave a man the right to beat his wife in the interest of maintaining family discipline. And the phrase, how many of you here have heard of the phrase rule of thumb? And even colloquially, we use that phrase. And probably after this, you might never use it again. But the phrase rule of thumb allowed a husband during this period of time to beat his wife as long as he made a mark that was no bigger than his thumb. Okay, so we even begin to see how languaging and linguistics are running parallel to some of the very same dynamics that are being put forth by a society around the ideas of women and children. We then move into early America and colonization, racism, and the period and legacy of enslavement and displacement removal of Black and Indigenous people. The racist and sexist ideas that our country has held and continues to hold can be traced back to the beginnings of this country and essentially have promoted the perspective of people as property. And when people are considered property, the main objective is to control over and to power over. And two of the core tenets of domestic violence that we'll come to is power and control, and how that is used in the relationship to manipulate and coerce another being. So it's particularly important that the legacy of colonization and racism, as it relates to sexism, has really set the tone for contemporary perspectives of gender-based violence and family violence. So I invite all of us here to just keep that in your back pocket, that this historical perspective is important. Contemporarily, it wasn't really until the beginnings of the civil rights and following feminist movement of the 1960s and later into the 70s that the problems of domestic abuse, as it was called during the period, were actually brought to the attention of the media. And really it wasn't until after 1980, around the early 1980s, when the efforts of combat veterans had legitimized the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that it actually became a little bit more clear that the psychological syndrome seen in survivors of rape, seen in survivors of domestic abuse, seen in survivors of incest, were essentially the same and was considered essentially the same syndrome or set of symptoms or set of behaviors seen in survivors of war. So, just taking a gentle glance at those dates, 1980 was not that far. It was not that long ago. And be thinking about yourselves in the context of these years. Again, this is a very brief history, an overview, but begin to just make the connections to where we are today with this.
We thought it was important to acknowledge the history of domestic violence and how that has shaped our view over the years. I, for sure, will not be using the phrase rule of thumb without connecting to its origin. Let's dive a little deeper as Jules discusses the dynamics of power and control so we can understand the inner workings of domestic violence a little bit better.
Well, Jules, you've been saying domestic violence, you've been saying intimate partner violence. Now, what the heck does that mean? I find it to be helpful when we all have a working definition. And the working definition of domestic violence that I tend to move from is this, that domestic violence is a pattern, and that is really key, a pattern of coercive behaviors of control someone in a relationship has. They can use those coercive behaviors of control through physical abuse, through the threat of physical abuse, repeated psychological abuse, sexual assault, progressive social isolation, deprivation, intimidation, or economic coercion, where that pattern of coercive behaviors looks to have power and control over the other person. And we can ask, okay, so that's the working definition. Now, who is domestic violence perpetrated by? And like you heard me say before, just now, historically, it's come to be known that the perpetration of domestic violence in these power and control dynamics, and the way that the media portrays this, is oftentimes seen through a cis man having power and control over a cis woman. And what we want to offer here, that in intimate partner violence, interpersonal violence, gender-based violence, family violence, that the people who cause harm can be adults, they can be adolescents, they can be, it can be against someone that they're in a relationship with, that they were formerly dating, that they were married or cohabitating. Really, all populations have the potential to cause harm. And while certain numbers and certain, again, going back to the idea of when a group is marginalized in our society, there may be other or prominent risk factors that make those populations more susceptible or more vulnerable to experiences of abuse. But really, anybody can cause harm to another human being when power and control is used in a coercive, patterned way. And so what do we mean by situational violence in a relationship versus domestic violence or intimate partner violence in a relationship? So what I want all of you to consider is that in situational violence, what we mean is that there's no pattern of that power and control. There's no installation of continuous fear. There are signs, most likely, of poor impulse control. And in situational violence, it's centered around one particular event. So that's a key defining feature that situational violence in a relationship can have. In intimate partner violence and domestic violence, there are those present dynamics of patterned power and control, an installation of a fear component, and it's not so much an issue of impulse control, but it's actually a very controlled, from the person who's causing harm, it's a very calculated and controlled set of behaviors. It's also not centered around a particular event. One of the key ways to tell the difference is through asking this question: is this person's life getting smaller because of this person? And if the person's life is getting smaller, that is a key indicator to me that this is patterned, that there's an installation of fear, that this is not about impulse control. This is about having a very intentional control in the relationship. And it's not centered around a particular event. In other words, domestic violence, in this sense, is a form of a chronic type of relationship trauma. It's patterned, it's pervasive, and it's oftentimes cyclical. Bringing in, again, kind of the awareness that how our media portrays domestic violence, we oftentimes only see it as something that's physical in nature or sexual violence. But what we oftentimes find, and the research also supports this, is that when it becomes elevated to the level of physical or sexual violence, that's often preceded by controlling behavior. That's often preceded by verbal forms of power and control over, verbal forms or emotional, psychological forms of abuse. And in our society, we're oftentimes not given the messages or the teaching to recognize that abusive behavior is identified through that as well, not just the physical and not just the sexual. I just mentioned also that the pervasive behavior is often cyclical. And what I mean by that is something that we call the cycle of violence. And the cycle of violence, essentially, and you'll get this in your handouts, illustrates that pattern that we see in these relationships. So the cycles of violence often increase over time, and then it tapers off, and then it resurfaces again. And there are key specific phases of this cycle that we want to keep in mind. And I want all of us here in this group to keep in mind. There's a tension building phase. So that's oftentimes where survivors say, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. I feel like one more thing and that could be it. So there's a building of tension. And then there is the attack. That could be the verbal attack, the physical attack. Then after the attack, there's often the remorse and the apology. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. I lost my temper. That's where we hear those kinds of phrasings, right, from the person who has caused the harm. So the apology is that next phase. And then shortly after that, there is usually a phase that's characterized by loving gestures, and otherwise known as the honeymoon phase or the honeymoon period. And this is where it can get really tricky, because the person who has been harmed begins to think and feel, okay, well, maybe this person has changed. Maybe they won't do this again. They're treating me really kindly now. They're really sweet to me. They're loving towards me. They're loving towards the kids again. So they're not going to attack, or they're not going to do this harmful behavior. But what we oftentimes find, and the research shows this in domestic violence work, is that the cycle does come back around. And in relationships, especially when there's, as things get progressively more intense in the relationship, the honeymoon period actually begins to phase out completely. So the pattern and the cycle then just oscillates between the building of the tension and the attack. Building a tension, attack, so on and so forth. So these are all things to be keeping in mind as you're holding space for the young people that you may be working with, or their parents. So this is what we mean by power and control dynamics and cycles and patterns in relationships.
Wow. Thank you, Jules, for highlighting why it's so important to recognize these patterns so we can better support survivors. I'm very interested to learn how to assess abusive relationships in this next segment.
Some warning signs that we want to keep in mind. People who commit violence against people in their lives can be very dangerous. We know that. But what makes those folks particularly dangerous is how undangerous they seem. So the hallmark, and we oftentimes talk about this in our field, is the hallmark of a person who uses power control in a relationship over another is their ability to camouflage the real identity of who they are and their behavior with anyone other than the victim. So domestic violence offenders are oftentimes kind. They're oftentimes charming and very, very charismatic. And we just want you to keep this in mind, that public behaviors do not predict or indicate private behaviors. And the research has told us over many years in this work that people who harm others oftentimes show you the face they want you to see when they want you to see it. In your risk assessments, and connected to this, we always ask about strangulation. You may not have an opportunity right now, given some of the settings that you're working in, to ask about strangulation, but we always encourage people to ask about, has your partner ever tried to block your airway? That strangulation is a very common and terrifying very dangerous, a very lethal form of physical abuse. And it's used to hurt and intimidate and silence the survivor. And it's one of the most lethal forms of domestic violence, and it's one of the best predictors of a future homicide in a domestic violence case. So whenever I'm working with someone, one of my ways of assessing is, has the person in your life ever tried to cut off your airway? Have they ever, some people know, even though choking and strangulation are very different, different legal stipulations, I may say, have ever they tried to choke you? If using the word strangulation is for that particular person, maybe too much of a trigger word for them. But that's something that I always want to be assessing for.
Now let's look into the risks and barriers to safety when assessing abusive relationships.
What are some of those other barriers that people may face when they're leaving? There's a lot of reasons why people choose to stay, or they may feel forced to stay in their relationship. They may not have another set of options, in other words. And what research also tells us is that on average, it can take up to 7 attempts for people to leave their relationship successfully. So some of those barriers are that there is a fear of increased violence or death. If I decide to leave and the person who's historically been abusing me catches wind of that, I may lose my life. The violence may increase if I try to leave. A very real fear of losing custody of children. We mentioned it before, financial struggles, no place to go, no access to resources. This is very, very real, in particular right now in the era of COVID-19. The financial struggles are very, very real in terms of having people decide to stay. What doesn't get talked about as much, and this could be a whole other course in itself, is feelings of attachment and love for the person who causes harm. That often in relationships, we see the whole person as not the whole problem, right? So we may not see them as the problem. Family, cultural, religious pressures are often another big barrier for people. So that's something to really be keeping in mind as you think about people's different social locations and the different ways that our identities have an impact on how we navigate our relationships and making decisions to leave or stay. The very real impact when we're in a relationship that has those patterned, pervasive power and control dynamics, we have a decreased sense of self-esteem, of helplessness. And the gaslighting factor is also an incredibly important component of it. Do I leave? Is there even anything wrong? Or am I just going crazy? And then another key barrier that ties back into that cycle of violence, remember we talked about that in our previous slides, is that in that honeymoon phase, there is also an installation of the hope that the abusive person will change. And that is a powerful conduit for giving the relationship a little bit longer. So this is powerful stuff. And we just want to have this on our radar as we're providing services for people that we're working with in our schools. We just want to be aware that this may be some of what's not so much spoken in our sessions, but it's occurring underneath the radar. One thing that I want to also say here, as we're talking about the assessment of abusive relationships, is that we never want to suggest or tell someone to leave their relationship, bringing it back up to the increased violence or increased likelihood of death. That if we tell somebody to leave and we're not the expert in their life, they're the expert in their life, we could get them killed. So, remember, it takes on average 7 tries for someone to leave an abusive relationship. what we want to be doing, and we'll also talk about this in upcoming slides, is that our role, our position as holding space for people in their healing around this is to facilitate the process of leaving through safety planning, through non-pressuring, open-ended interventions, and through creating empowerment through choice.
It's important to remember empowerment when we support survivors of domestic violence. Thank you for that reminder, Jules. I'm eager to hear strategies to support students through such a difficult time in their life. Let's take a listen.
Taking it also to the strategies, the actual concrete strategies, whether you're on Zoom or whether you're in person, listening with what I like to call, and this is also kind of an IFS term, an internal family systems term, compassionate curiosity. So we're coming in with compassion, we're coming in with a curiosity. Curiosity doesn't mean that we agree with our clients or that we co-sign their behaviors. Compassionate curiosity means that we are helping them build an inquiry, kind of a skills-based inquiry, that we may be presenting things to them, they may be considering it in their head, they may then consider it in their heart, and then they may try a different practice out. So compassionate curiosity allows us to offer support without judging. When we're speaking in that nurturing, calm manner, that's really in terms of meeting someone when they may be in crisis. I always share this with people who I'm supervising, that just because someone that you're working with is in crisis doesn't mean that you have to be in crisis also. So really kind of maintaining that groundedness and really using your voice as a means of connection, that can really be helpful as a technique to engage with folks who are surviving these kinds of relationships. Connected to that, tone, intonation, cadence, a calming voice goes a very long way. Again, we won't have time to get into it, but Stephen Porges and polyvagal theory has there's a whole set of research and neurobiology that's being looked into and has been looked into around what is it about our voice that really helps our nervous system come back into a state of equilibrium. So you could even Google that and find out more, but speaking in a calming voice is very important. Checking in, does the person really understand what is being talked about? These are all really important factors as you're holding space for people in whatever platform that is. I often recommend to people that are working in school-based systems, don't do this work by yourself. Even you showing up today on our group together here lets me know that you're interested in working in community. In other words, we don't want to replicate the isolation that was running rampant in the relationship. So we really want to help people explore community engagement and healthy practices. And part of that can be as the therapist or as the teacher or as the support service provider, that we're also not doing this work by ourselves.
When Jules does these presentations for us, she always leaves such great resources in PowerPoint form. So right now, I want you to get your pen and paper ready so that you can take them down for your records. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, thehotline.org. Safe Horizon NYC, safehorizon.org. The New York City Hotline, 1-800-656-HOPE. National Dating Abuse Helpline, 866-331-9474. The National Sex Assault Hotline, 1-800-656-HOPE. And lastly, the National Parent Helpline, 858-427-2736. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Classroom Café. Please remember to like and subscribe so you can get all the updates for our upcoming episodes. Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Classroom Café. If you are a UFT member, the Members Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or at mapinfo@uft.org.